Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Conversation Corner with Kimberly Douglas. I'm your host, Kimberly Douglas, and I am very excited about today's conversation. So, today's episode is inspired by a few things. One, an article that I read recently on Substack called Is it ADHD or Brain Rot? Two, just all of the misconceptions and assumptions that I've heard about ADHD that we're going to get into and debunk a little bit today. And three, the age old question, which I am so tired of hearing, aren't we all a little ADHD? Today, we're going to talk about it. Let's get into it. So, as I mentioned, today's episode is inspired by an article that I recently read on Substack. I have been getting into Substack a little bit more. I heard about it just earlier this year, and I love it. It's a platform, it's an app where you can read people's short stories, content rather, short articles, and just think pieces. And I really like the format of it. I like that it keeps me in a digital space, but gets me off of social media, keeps me from doom scrolling. And I really enjoy a lot of the things I've read on there so far. So today we'll be talking about an article called Is it ADHD or Brain Rot? This article was written by Rach Idowu, an African woman who hosts a blog called Adulting with ADHD. I've been following Rach for some time now, and I've been following her journey with ADHD. I've been reading how she depicts her experience with ADHD and ADHD on a whole. And I just really love seeing the perspective of a fellow Black woman living with ADHD. It really, once again, hits home with the way I value representation and the importance of just having different people, especially people who look like you and have a similar background to you, speaking on an experience that you both live with. So let's get straight into it because we got a lot to cover today. So in this article, Rach is basically posing the question, is it ADHD or brain rot, to unpack the differences between brain rot that we're seeing in the collective currently, at a time where social media is a huge source of entertainment, as well as the rise of AI and AI slop. And I just really love the way that she briefly breaks it down, briefly but effectively, really touches on how this topic affects the ADHD community. So, we're going to just go through the article a little bit, and I'll give you guys a brief recap, starting with what brain rot actually is. So a lot of us, especially within my generation, have probably already heard about brain rot. If you haven't, then here's a brief definition. So the Oxford Dictionary defines brain rot as the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as the result of overconsumption of material, now particularly online content, considered to be trivial or unchallenging. So that's a bit of a long-winded definition, but in its essence, brain rot is basically the deterioration of our mental and intellectual state, especially in this era of social media, especially in this era of overconsumption of online material, content. Brain rot is very prevalent amongst the collective. So basically, in Rach's article, she outlines that post-pandemic, many people are noticing that they've had shorter attention spans. They're struggling to focus on anything longer than short pieces of text or short videos or a 140 character tweet, for example. So because of this, a lot of people have been suspecting whether or not they are living with ADHD, which is fair. That's okay. But it has kind of created an environment online where people have been using ADHD just as a buzzword, and that can lead to some more damaging, harmful rhetoric and patterns. So a lot of people who are feeling this change, the shift in their attention span, the struggle to focus, the issue with doom scrolling and being addicted to their phones, a lot of this is mainly a result of habits such as meme hopping, binge watching reaction videos, and once again, doom scrolling. Doom scrolling in itself is just kind of a buzz term as well, which describes being stuck in that state of just scrolling for hours and hours and hours, often with no end in sight. That can take up so much of our time. It can waste a lot of our time. And it can put us in this state where we don't even realize sometimes how long we've been doing it. So, Rach in this article, she emphasizes that ADHD and brain rot can definitely feel similar, and that as humans, we can all experience symptoms of ADHD without actually having ADHD and being diagnosed. But in this case, although brain rot can feel similar, brain rot is often reversible. It's reversible through changes in habits, consumption, and discipline over time, where in comparison, ADHD requires a more consistent long-term lifestyle with specific treatments that work for the individual. I think it's important to note, and it was noted as well in Rach's article, that ADHD is not just about being distracted. It's not just a disorder surrounding a short attention span and the stereotypes that come with it. And because of that, it shouldn't just be reduced to that. She also really hammers home the fact that we should be mindful when labeling everyday issues and attention span struggles as ADHD, because it definitely creates a domino effect of how not only how society views ADHD, but how we talk about it, how we portray it in media, which is what we've been talking about this entire series. And it honestly just contributes to watering down the reality of living with ADHD, which can be harmful to real ADHDers who are seeking support and accommodations. I really loved this article. I thought it was a nice bite-sized piece of content that was brief enough to, ironically, keep your attention span, but also effective enough to make sure that you really understood what she was talking about. I think it's a no-brainer. It's a very obvious observation that post-pandemic, a lot of us have experienced a decline in our cognitive and mental health collectively all over the world. When we look back on COVID and think about COVID, and I will say not COVID itself, but our time in lockdown, our time experiencing a mass pandemic as like a once in a lifetime thing, the whole world was on the same page for a point in time there. And while that is historical, I think it also really just served as a great moment in history for anthropologists and sociologists and even psychologists in fields studying things like this, like neurodivergence, to just see the difference in human cognitive health over time. So I'm sure that the collective cognitive health of humans, say in the 90s, for example, when the internet was non-existent, or I'm aging myself. I'm definitely aging myself. I don't know that the internet was completely non-existent in the 90s, but there was a lot more limits to what we could do with technology and social media. I'll put it that way. But at a time where phones looked different, where computers looked different, where we weren't as connected to each other via bandwidth as we are now, that is a huge difference to how we're living in 2025, where our friends are just a call away, a FaceTime away, Instagram DM away. It's really shaped how we view our relationships, how we connect with other humans, and now just how we think. Our habits, of course, create our lifestyle, and habits such as doom scrolling, meme hopping, binge watching, gives way to brain rot. So I really wanted to bring up this article mainly because when I first saw it, it just lit a fire in me. It felt so on the nose about what this entire series is covering, what we've been talking about thus far, and what we will talk about as we wrap up. And it also just really put into perspective something that I've been thinking about for some time now. We live in a time where people with ADHD are still being misdiagnosed, misunderstood, and mistreated, while simultaneously witnessing people online treating ADHD like it's trendy, or kind of throwing it around as this common term, this buzzword, which can all just be very polarizing and very confusing, to be honest, as well as a bit offensive, if I can be real. ADHD is not trendy. It's not a TikTok sound. It's not the dance of the day. It's not a meme. It's not something to be kind of just treated as a bandwagon. And yet we are witnessing that a lot online, which is honestly a bit upsetting. I think it's also worth noting that in her article, Rach mentions that she's not trying to dismiss anyone's suspicion of thinking they have ADHD, or the impact of, the pandemic and stress that could have enhanced their symptoms and put them in a position in 2025 to feel like, hey, I think I'm living with ADHD. In no way was she trying to diminish anyone's suspicions or feelings that they should go get a diagnosis. But she was mainly just hammering home the importance of language and how we choose our language. Because when we speak about ADHD in a way that is just very laissez-faire, like we all live with this, we all deal with this, it's just something that we all have, it kind of just contributes to the trivialization of it. It contributes to the fact that people with ADHD still feel misunderstood. And it also generalizes the condition as opposed to zoning in on the fact that it's not a monolith. Let's talk a little bit about the generalization of ADHD and how asking questions like, aren't we all a little ADHD, can actually be more harmful than people realize. So, first of all, if I had $1 for every time I heard someone ask that question, I would have a lot of dollars. Okay? I can't remember the very first time I heard that question asked. I can't remember the very first time I heard somebody have that thought out loud, but I do remember the most recent time I've heard it, which was as early as about a month or two ago, and it came out of the mouth of one of my professors. And I remember just thinking in that moment that question is just thrown around a little bit too much. I remember feeling a bit cringe, I'm not gonna lie. Not super uncomfortable or offended or like put off to the point where I, had a conversation with that professor or thought to drop their class or anything of that sort. It really was said in a very passing way that I believe their intentions weren't harmful, but the impact was confusing. So I remember cringing a bit at the question itself, and it was just something that came up in the middle of a lecture one day. And I remember just thinking, we're adding that to the project. We're adding that to the podcast because, give me a break. My immediate answer, when I hear people ask, aren't we all a little ADHD? My immediate answer is, well, no. We can all experience symptoms that people with ADHD experience. But the way that ADHD is classified is not just about if you've been experiencing those symptoms all of a sudden, or since the pandemic hit, or because you've addicted to your phone for the past few years. No, ADHD is classified by usually symptoms that have been seen in childhood already and are prolonged over time into adulthood. So I think it's just important to be mindful of, once again, our language, the things we say, how we say them, and just making sure that we're educating ourselves so we're not generalizing scenarios that are actually very personal. I think that in our last conversation in this series, the conversation I had with my parents, my mom also mentioned something along the lines of feeling like we all have a little bit of ADHD. And I actually kind of love that that happened to come out of her mouth in that moment because um because it just felt like a transition to this episode. And it also felt like a teachable moment to my parents, who we kind of have a symbiotic relationship where we're always teaching each other. So I wasn't super offended when she said it because my mom is very open and honest about still learning and growing in her education on ADHD, as she loves someone like myself with ADHD. But when she mentioned it, and if you've seen our last episode, you might have seen that moment. When she mentioned it, I was like, I disagree, but I'm not mad that you mentioned that because we're going to talk about it. And here we are. Another thing that is really worth touching on is executive function. So as humans, we all have executive functions. And executive functions are basically a set of mental skills that enable goal-directed behavior involving the organization of thoughts and purposeful activity. Got a lot of definitions today, but that is a fancy way of saying that we have 8 main categories within our minds, within our brains as human, that allow us to work through life, complete tasks, initiate tasks, and basically just handles many parts of the brain, our memory, etc. So I'm going to go through the executive functions, and we're going to talk a little bit about how executive function doesn't automatically mean ADHD, and how executive dysfunction is something that can be experienced by folks with ADHD, but also folks without it. As humans, we have 8 executive functions. 1 is impulse control. This is our ability to think before acting. 2, and not necessarily in any specific order, but 2 is our emotional control. And this is our ability to keep our feelings check, regulate our emotions, things of that sort. 3 is flexible thinking. So flexible thinking is being able to adjust behavior to unexpected changes. Number 4 is our working memory. Our working memory keeps key information in mind so we're able to use it either in the moment or later. Number 5 is self-monitoring. This is self-awareness to how one is doing in the moment. Number 6 is planning and prioritizing. This is our ability to set and meet goals. Number 7 is task initiation, which is our ability to take action to begin tasks. And number 8 is organization, which is our ability to keep track of things both physically and mentally. So when we talk about executive function, we're talking about 8 different facets that work together almost like gears in our brain to make sure that everything is moving well. Folks with ADHD often struggle with executive dysfunction, which is just a fancy way of saying that we struggle with our executive functions, or that these are things that don't come naturally or easily to folks with ADHD because of the atypical amount of dopamine in the brain or the atypical amount of neurotransmitters, etc. So ADHD symptoms can affect executive function, but also the collective change in the way that the way that we've been thinking, the way we've been engaging with online content, the way we've been honestly addicted to our devices. That can also affect our executive dysfunction. Executive dysfunction and ADHD are not interchangeable, but the two kind of go hand in hand. So if you have ADHD, you're likely to experience struggling with your executive functioning, but you can also struggle with your executive functioning and be neurotypical. So I think that's really important to mention, because almost any time I have a conversation with someone who's likely neurotypical, or who is neurotypical, anytime I have a conversation with someone who is likely neurotypical, but could be neurodivergent or are concerned that they're neurodivergent, I always bring up executive function, because I just like to let people know that you can experience struggling with your emotional control, with your organization, with your planning and organizing, and not be living with ADHD. It's still something that's worth checking out and looking into. It's still something that is absolutely worthy of the time and compassion that ADHD also gets. I think understanding that difference, that fine line between living with ADHD and experiencing executive function and being neurotypical and having issues with your executive function, that's very important to differentiate. And it's also important to just understand the difference and be okay with the fact that the two can coexist. I think that is largely what Rach Idowu is trying to hammer home in her article, and I really just love the way that she put it. Okay, so now let's talk about some misconceptions of ADHD. These are kind of just a list of things that I've jotted down based on things that I've heard over the years, as well as just some research that I've done for some of the main assumptions and misconceptions that people have when it comes to the topic of ADHD. So the first one is that people with ADHD can't focus. I think that this largely comes from the fact that our ability to focus and our concentration is a large point that people speak of when they talk about ADHD. I think it also stems from the first D in ADHD, which is deficit. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? But a lot of people in the neurodivergent community, the ADHD community, over the years, they've kind of come with different criticisms of how ADHD is named, because in reality, ADHD is not exactly a deficit of attention. It's not exactly a lack of focus, because in reality, and we've spoken about this on this platform, a lot of folks with ADHD have the ability to hyperfocus, and we're actually great at it. We have this ability to hyperfixate on a topic once we get into the flow, especially if that topic is a special interest of ours. I know in our last episode with my parents, I was quizzing them and I talked to them about hyperfixations. And I mentioned that one of my hyperfixations was music, because I grew up as a performing artist, and also elephants, because that's my favorite animal. And I have a huge collection of elephant-related items. What I think I really meant to say in that moment, and I actually caught myself when I watched the footage back, was that there are hyperfixations and there are special interests. So I think I find myself using those terms interchangeably at times, which is why it felt so natural to explain it that way to my parents. But you can hyperfixate on something that's not a special interest of yours, but a special interest is something that you kind of devote so much time and energy and research and effort to, such as elephants in my sense, or music in my sense. Special interests are great because they often become a part of the person's personality. It is often something that us folks with ADHD become so knowledgeable about that it just makes us so excited to tell a fun fact or talk about for hours. So yeah, that was just a little bit of an edit, kind of a walk back to the last episode. Not because I felt like I said something completely wrong, but because I think that the term special interest is also something worth knowing and educating folks about. I also jotted down here that there's so many forms of hyperfixations. We spoke about some with my parents, but a few others that came to mind are foods. Food can be a hyperfixation. I personally hyperfixate on certain meals, certain foods that taste really, really great to me in a certain season, and I'll eat the same dinner, the same lunch, the same breakfast, the same meal or snack every day until I'm sick of it. And then it's like on to the next. Hyperfixations can also be people, they can be places, like it's a large umbrella. Let's go on to our second misconception. Misconception number 2 is that masking makes you fake. So we live in a world and a time specifically now where a lot of people talk about how they really want to live in their authenticity. A lot of people talk about how we should be authentic in the way that we present ourselves in any setting, but specifically online. We have a lot of influencers, content creators, people who have a platform online hammering home on authenticity and what that means. The reason I put this on the list is because I believe that people tend to assume that masking is something that is calculated and targeted, that people with ADHD are doing to slither their way into certain settings or certain conversations, or to pretend, act fake around others, to seem like we're all on the same page. In reality, I would view masking as less as like putting on a personality and more like suppressing one's personality as a survival mechanism to feel safe and accepted in certain settings. Now, I have come a long way in my journey from feeling like the odd one out to wanting so badly to fit in certain spaces to now being so unapologetically in my truth and accepting who I am as a person, regardless of what others think about it. But different people with ADHD are at different stages in their journey. And even me, someone who has come to this level of acceptance with myself and what I live with and the way that my brain works, I still have moments where I mask and I catch myself slipping back into those patterns because I just don't feel safe in certain scenarios. Not everyone deserves to know the deeper parts of you. And with ADHD, it can feel like you have this huge secret that nobody else knows about. Not everybody feels comfortable telling others that they have ADHD and even presenting in their most natural form where their symptoms are evident. That can come from past experience of feeling like they could open up in a room with others and being met with mistreatment or a response that hurt the ADHDer. Masking happens for so many different reasons. And so for folks to just diminish it as being fake or acting fake, in my opinion, I don't think it really sums it up for what it truly is. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the misconception that ADHD and autism and other forms of neurodivergent are just quote unquote kid things or kid conditions or kid disorders. Basically, the idea that being neurodivergent can only be present in children, as well as the infantilization of neurodivergent people once they've transitioned to adulthood. So let me cook with this a little. I know I just said a lot, but basically, we hear terms in society like high functioning, low functioning, things of that sort to describe how severe somebody's neurodivergence is, right? But in reality, I think it's better to view that as different levels of support. So high support, low support, medium support, based on how much the person may need support or accessibility to resources to function within society. I also think that, I know that many people with ADHD have a very childlike way of viewing the world. You know, I wouldn't say that we're mentally still children, but because of the biology of ADHD and the fact that a lot of parts of the ADHD brain don't develop until later in life, we do still feel connected to a lot of our childhood memories, the things we enjoyed as children, our childlike special interests, things of that sort. However, when we infantilize neurodivergent people, it can be very harmful. Many people with ADHD have a very childlike way of viewing the world. Just because someone is in tune with their inner child does not mean that they are childish. I often call myself childlike because I'm actually very mature for my age, and based on the peers that I was raised around, I've just always kind of picked up concepts quicker than others. Not as a bragging point or any way to put down the people that I grew up around, but it just goes to show that it can be this very weird polarizing world as a person with ADHD. Being told as a child that you're so wise beyond your ears and being so in touch with your inner child as an adult, and then having that narrative switch to you're so childish. But the reality is a lot of people with ADHD are unfortunately parentified as a child or forced to grow up quicker or just see the harsh realities of life much earlier than a child should have to. And unfortunately, that takes away a lot of our innocence. and it puts us in a position to understand that the world can be very cruel. That's something that we learn early oftentimes because, for being honest, the world is not the kindest to people who are neurodivergent, especially when they know for a fact that you are and not just suspect that you are. This next misconception actually kind of ties into what we were just talking about, treating neurodivergent folks as quote unquote stupid or quote unquote slow. So the ADHD brain is wired to think differently. We know this. We've talked about this. Our whole series speaks on this. But ADHD brains tend to have a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. We are also more wired to find alternative solutions to problems, and we're really good at making connections. If you've ever had a conversation with someone with ADHD and you've noticed how quickly the topic can flip from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, just know that you're talking to someone who's really great at making connections. Sometimes I start a thought, and where that thought goes, how it progresses, and where it ends up is completely different than the original thought I had. But in my mind, I can work it back through the web of thoughts to what I was thinking earlier. And I think it's really cool having a brain that makes so many connections. But I think it's important to hammer that reality home because a lot of people just assume that because you think differently and your brain is wired different, that there must be something wrong with you. That it's an insult on your intelligence often. As a person who's neurodivergent, it can be upsetting hearing others insult your intelligence just because you don't get to the same answer the way they did, or because you think of things differently, point things out that others may have missed. Also, it's important to note that folks with ADHD and neurotypical brains have a different processing system. So let's go back to that stereotype of being quote unquote slow, which I would call more of an insult. When we call someone slow, we're basically insinuating that they can't keep up, that they're not on the same pace as everyone else, that we're over here on one topic and they're over here completely in a different book. But the reality is, living with ADHD means that your processing system is different than people with neurotypical brains. And often you process things in a more delayed manner. So a perfect example of this is being mistreated. Being mistreated as a person with ADHD, being bullied or experiencing sarcastic remarks from people who make fun of you just for being different, right? In the moment, you may not even know what's going on. People may kind of pick at you in a way that's kind of passive aggressive. And in the moment, you may not realize that you are the butt of the joke. But later on, often long after that conversation is finished, a lot of ADHD folks find themselves in the shower or on a walk or just doing something casual around the house. And it hits us like, wait a minute, those people were being rude. They were insulting me. They were trying to hurt my feelings. And that is the reality of living with the processing system that can be delayed. In the moment, you may not completely realize what is going on, but later you do. And with delayed processing system, sometimes comes a delay of reaction and feelings. And so some people with ADHD often struggle with just feeling like we have this pressure to get over things quickly, or feeling like we're wrong for still feeling hurt about something that happened 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago. But the reality is our processing system is different. So even though it was 3 weeks ago, it could be 3 months ago. Once our brains have processed it, it can feel as fresh as this morning. Our next misconception is that people with ADHD are quote unquote in the clouds. We are unaware or out of the loop. This one is interesting because I don't completely disagree that people with ADHD can be a little bit out of the loop at times, because I think living with ADHD is often living in your own little world. And especially if you've had a journey where you spent a lot of your years masking or feeling like you couldn't be your full authentic self, a lot of us have created a safe space, a little world in our minds that we kind of vacation to, just to know that we feel safe and that we can be ourselves there. So especially with inattentive type ADHD, which is what I live with, you can often feel like you're living inside of your own head. Like you're in your head all the time. And that's where the intrusive thoughts, the overthinking, the ruminating on things comes from. But just to debunk this one and to give a reality check, basically, I would say that's mainly what it is. Living in our own world, experiencing a lot of inner thoughts, and feeling like we're trapped in our own minds sometimes can come across as being quote unquote unaware, in the clouds, out of the loop. But also, another reality is that people with ADHD are much more aware than you may think. We are often very observant people. We have very strong pattern recognition skills. And depending on our past, depending on some of the things we've experienced, we're really good at just recognizing patterns in behavior and observing people more than they might realize. Living with ADHD also means that we have a strong sense of justice and empathy. And that could also partially come from just being different, living in a world where you feel like the odd one out, and understanding what that can feel like and what that can do to a person. I think when you've experienced that side of life, you deal with it one of two ways. You either continue the cycle or you choose to break it and be brave enough to say that you're okay with being different. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that people with ADHD are unaware exactly, especially about what's going on in the world and in society. A lot of the folks I know who are neurodivergent, are some of the biggest advocates I know for social issues, for things going on in their community. A lot of them are community organizers and people who really care about social justice. Our next misconception is actually like a quote. So this one is, just try harder, buy a planner, and apply yourself more. Now, buy a planner is another one of those terms, those sentences, like the aren't we all a little ADHD, that kind of like triggers me because so many people have advised me to use a planner throughout my life. People have even bought me planners as gifts. And to this day, sorry, y'all, but to this day, a lot of those planners are empty because that's just not how my brain organizes information and stores information. Also, not to mention that living with ADHD and using a planner requires you to stay consistent, to remember that you have a planner that you're using, things of that sort. And it can just be very difficult for some people. For others, it may be the method. It may be something that they really love and choose daily. But that just, once again, circles back to the fact that ADHD is not a monolith and different things work for different people. But personally, for this girl right here, planners have never really done too much. Telling folks with ADHD to just try harder is honestly a bit ignorant. I think it, once again, just diminishes the reality of living with ADHD. I think it also places a bit of blame on the person living with ADHD because the reality is we wake up every day and we try as hard as we can. We try our best, but sometimes our best on one day is 90% and our best on another day is 15%. But to have someone look at you in your face when you're tired and burnt out and lost the capacity to do everything that you're doing, to have someone just tell you to try harder can be really saddening. It can really diminish the reality of what you're living with. And it's just not my favorite thing to hear. Applying yourself more is something that I feel like a lot of ADHD people have heard a lot from like teachers throughout the years, like on report cards. That's one of the common comments that I think a lot of people with ADHD find as a trend throughout their childhood. When I was going through my diagnosis journey, I was instructed to bring in as many report cards that I could find with comments so that the people conducting my test could look through what my teacher said about me growing up. And a lot of my comments, a lot of my teachers didn't really talk about applying myself. When I was going through my own diagnosis journey, I was instructed by the people conducting my test to bring in as many report cards as I could find with comments from teachers when I was a kid. And even though I didn't have many comments about applying myself more or trying harder or being more present, a lot of my comments were about me being chatty in class, being a social butterfly, things of that sort that ultimately contributed to the evidence I needed to show that I could get a clear diagnosis for my ADHD. What I have noted here for this misconception is that people with ADHD don't need validation or even belief from others to determine their choices in lives. And I think that just honestly says a lot for itself, just that one sentence, that a lot of people tend to behave in society. And I'm not saying this is the majority, I'm just saying this is what I've come across. A lot of people tend to behave that if they don't understand or if they choose not to believe that ADHD is your reality or a reality, they tend to invalidate the feelings of neurodivergent people and water the situation down to you just need to try harder, you just need to buy a planner, you just need to apply yourself more. So that's where I stand on that one. And honestly, I feel like it comes back to language, the importance of language, and how we can use language to either harm or help. Finally, our last misconception that I chose to contribute to this is ADHD is a superpower. Now, I really wanted to talk about this one because I think this is a great example of a compliment that can truly come with pure intentions, but that can do more harm than good, depending on the person. Once again, we got to remember, ADHD is not a universal monolith. Not everyone experiences this condition the same way. Not everyone views their ADHD as something positive. Not everyone can see the silver lining in living with ADHD. For me personally, I don't love this term. It's the reason I called it a misconception. It's the reason I put it on this list. I don't love this term because it can often feel like toxic positivity. And if you've never heard of toxic positivity, it's basically just a way of saying that we can be positive in our intentions, but we can actually be doing some harm with our words, and the impact of what we're saying can really hurt people more than we realize. So saying that ADHD is a superpower, I can see on one side how people would see ADHD as being, a condition where a lot of people experience, like I said, being someone who has a strong sense of justice, someone who's compassionate and caring. I would say that I'm a very creative person. I would partially attribute that to my ADHD and partially attribute that to just my upbringing, my surroundings, growing up with parents who really valued music and the arts. On the other hand, and in reality, ADHD can often feel very paralyzing. It can feel like a burden most days, and it can feel like struggling to just complete basic tasks and do basic things. Adulting, as we've been calling it these days, can feel 10 times harder with ADHD, and things as simple as reaching out to friends, responding to text messages and emails, and just getting basic chores done around the house can feel like metaphorically pushing a large boulder up a steep hill. So when you're experiencing all of that, and then you hear someone get online or in person and say to your face, oh, well, that's ADHD is your superpower, it can once again just feel invalidating and not like your reality. So once again, language is important. Let's think before we speak. Let's ask people how they view their own ADHD and what it's like living with it from their perspective, as opposed to imposing onto them, projecting what we believe ADHD might be. Just for the sense of intersectionality, because we've been speaking a lot on representation in this series, and it's no secret that I am a Black woman. So this term, ADHD is a superpower, kind of reminds me of the trope of the strong Black woman. So for many years, Black women have been viewed as quote unquote strong and resilient for continuing to live and be brave enough to live in our truth and stand in our truth, despite everything that society throws at us. Being a Black woman is lovely. I wouldn't change it for the world. In the same breath, the world makes it difficult because of the stereotypes they place on us, the pressure they place on us, and the way that they portray us in media, movies, music, and throughout society. Black women are still struggling to be heard and seen, respected, and treated equally as their male counterparts and their non-Black counterparts, and even their female counterparts of different races. The reality is being both Black and female, and on top of it, living at the intersection of those two things and neurodivergence is a very unique experience. So over time, a lot of Black women have really started to dislike that saying of like, you're so strong, because we've been that for so long. And it's actually really exhausting. A lot of Black women do not want to be strong anymore. We want to be soft and be able to feel like we can be in touch with our own emotions, be weak in moments where life is heavy, and allow ourselves to just feel the wide range of what it's like to be human. That is something that came to mind when I thought about the ADHD as a superpower trope, because as a Black woman with ADHD, I've heard a fair share of sayings, terms, and compliments that have a good intention, but kind of fall flat in practice. So it's just so important that we understand how to relate to each other in a way that's open and honest and allows people to tell us their story as opposed to jumping to conclusions and assuming what their story might be. I have thoroughly loved talking about this topic. I really enjoyed that article. I will definitely make sure to input the link to it or the details to it so that if you'd like, you can do further research on Rach Idowu and her writing, as well as her blog, Adulting with ADHD. And with that, that is the end of our episode. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you took in some new information. And I hope that you also were challenged to think about how you currently view ADHD and maybe some misconceptions that you had about it. Thank you again for listening. I've been Kimberly Douglas, and this has been Conversation Corner. This podcast was created for education and entertainment purposes only. All included content is 100% the personal opinions, experiences, and research of Kimberly Douglas. Thank you for tuning into Conversation Corner with Kimberly Douglas. Until next time, stay educated, think critically, and question everything.